This is Garis book readings of my two published paper books written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. This is chapter 1 of my book Multis and Monos, what the multicultured can teach the monocultured towards the creation of a global state. This is chapter 1 entitled Introduction. I will read out the section headings of this chapter. A. Overview of the book. B. Multis and Monos. C. From multis to globals. D. Globa, the idea of a global state. E. History of ideas for creating a global state. F. The historical size of political units. G. Building Globa, the political goal of the century. A. Overview of the book. This book is based on several basic ideas. A. Monos, that is, monocultured people, suffer unnecessarily due to the limitations of the single culture that programs them. Monos would be happier if they became more multi, that is, multicultured, by absorbing the superior aspects of other cultures. B. Extrapolating the above argument to its logical limit of absorbing the superior aspects of all cultures on the planet motivates the creation of a global state. This book attempts to educate people that they are indeed limited as individuals by the limitations of the single culture that programs them. As the author of this book, I am unusual in the sense of having lived more than a year in each of 7 different countries, and hence have a multicultural perspective on the world. One of the main lessons I've gleaned from this multicultural experience is that monos suffer unnecessarily due to their monocultured ignorance of the superiorities of other cultures. Characteristic of monos is that they are not even aware that they are monos. All peoples are products of their cultures. For example, the languages they speak, the values they hold, the ways that they laugh, the ways they walk, the ways they carry their bodies, the ways they smile, the types of jobs they have, their lifestyles, their standards of living, their levels of education, etc. Monos are typically culture shocked when they start living in a second culture. They are forced to become conscious that they have been monoed by their first culture. That is, they have been programmed to think and behave in a certain way, and that there are other ways to think and behave that are characteristic of other cultures. Most people choose not to become multis. They avoid the experience of actually living in another culture, a choice that is often based on a fleeting experience of being a tourist in another culture and feeling discomforted by its alien differences. They prefer their home sweet home, with the comfortable familiarities they grew up with and absorbed as babies and children. The basic reality of the world at the present time is that most people around the world are monos, but modern life is inevitably generating more and more multis. For example, we live in an economy that is more and more global, thanks to modern passenger jets, telecommunications, the internet, satellites, high-speed trains, etc. A global economy implies the need for global business deals, so that millions of people are now spending a non-negligible proportion of their time sitting in airplanes, travelling from continent to do business. The internet is spreading ideas more readily across the planet. Internet telephone and web cameras are allowing more cross-cultural relationships and marriages, etc. There are many factors that are pushing people to expand their cultural horizons from the national level to the global level. I believe I am one of those people who have coined the terms mono and multi to make the distinction between people who have been monocultured and those who have been multicultured. What is interesting with multis is that they usually prefer the company of other multis. Why is this? Typically, when a multi is dealing with a mono, the unconscious limitations of the monocultured programming of the mono seem limiting and provincial to the multi. If the multi actually complains to the mono about this, the mono will not have a clue what the multi is talking about. The mono will not have a sense of cultural relativity, meaning that the values of the mono will be largely unquestioned, unconscious. A mono is typically unaware that he's been programmed by his culture and will judge others according to the values that his culture programmed him to accept. In most cases, these values are deeply unconscious and therefore unquestioned. So when a mono starts judging the multi according to the mono's monocultured values and does not question them, then to the multi this seems very limiting, narrow, provincial, even boring. To multis, monos are unable on the whole to step back from their own culture's values and look at them from a more global perspective. The mono simply does not have that perspective. The mono is a mono and just does not possess that wider framework in which to question and even reject certain aspects of his monocultured conditioning. These limitations of the mono from the perspective of the multi are a real disadvantage of the mono. It's therefore not surprising that multis much prefer the company and conversation of other multis. Monos to multis seem almost like children in the sense of blindly accepting customs and values of the monocultures that the monos grew up in. Once a mono becomes a multi, that is, starts absorbing the values and customs of a second or third or fourth ... culture, then that person obviously becomes much richer culturally. Unfortunately, the desire to become a multi under present circumstances is still a minority interest. Admittedly, millions of people are forced by their jobs, etc., to become more multi, but they still prefer the comforts of their monocultured familiarity. As will be stated several times in this book, when a multi interacts with another multi, even if their two sets of cultures do not overlap at all, provided of course that they can speak to each other in a shared language, there will be a sense of the other person having a sense of cultural relativity, and hence a greater tolerance of cultural difference. A mono, however, will probably find the foreignness of the multi alien and disturbing. It's thus difficult and frustrating for the multi to deal with this. With two multis, however, each will expect the cultural differences of the other and not be so disturbed by them. Also, the multis may, by personality, be more curious about the cultural differences and be motivated to explore the minds of other multis. Multis tend to be curious people. They often like to explore other cultural worlds, absorbing what they feel to be the superior aspects of the new cultures into their personalities. This absorption of superior aspects of other cultures into one's head is one of the major themes of this book. To make the point that there are definitely superior aspects of other cultures and that monos could become happier people by becoming conscious of them, and in brackets, and by implication becoming conscious of the relative inferiorities of their own monocultures, in bracket, is the topic of the first several chapters of this book. These chapters deal with the superiorities and inferiorities as seen through my eyes of the cultures I've lived in most cases. The point of this presentation of pros and cons of each culture is to attempt to make monocultured readers aware that it's possible they might be doing themselves damage by continuing to adhere blindly to their own monocultured values. By stating quite bluntly and clearly the disadvantages and inferiorities of each culture, as I see them of course, I am hoping that my mono readers will be shocked into recognition that they have something to learn from the superiorities of other cultures, that they too can become multis, at least to some extent. Of course, the most effective way to become a multi is simply to live for some time in another culture or cultures. The bluntness of the presentation of the cons of each culture is deliberate. I choose not to pull punches, that is, I prefer negative honesty to diplomatic lies. If one is trying to teach monos of the, quote, wickedness of their ways, it's my experience the most effective way in the long term is to simply tell the truth, warts and all. This may not be the best strategy in the short term, because negative truth can hurt, and in fact hurt so much that the reader is inclined to stop reading and hence will not continue to learn. But a bruised ego tends to remain bruised, and thus motivated to return to the scene of the crime, so to speak. If the cons are stated coherently, honestly, and critically, then an intellectually honest person, even though bruised by the harshness of the criticism, should be open enough to begin to accept the idea that the cons of his own culture may make sense, and if so, then to the extent that that person is a victim of those cultural disadvantages, he may actually benefit from changing his customs towards the superiorities of other cultures. I gave an early draft of this book to a handful of people of different cultures, whose pros and cons are discussed in this book. It was most interesting to note their reactions, which I report on here. Most of the people were Maltese, who had lived in 2 or more of the cultures I talk about in this book. Let us say that they lived in both countries X and Y. Let us also assume that my criticisms of both countries were more or less equally harsh. Then it was interesting to watch the reactions of 2 such Maltese, one who grew up in X and the other in Y. The person who grew up in X but lived in Y would get quite emotional and feel disturbed by the criticisms, the cons, of X. The person who grew up in Y but lived in X was much less disturbed by the cons of X. I would hear from the second person, yes, your criticisms of X are valid. I have felt this too. Whereas the person who grew up in X would tend to say, intellectually, I see what you are saying about my childhood country is valid. My experience living in Y has taught me that. Nevertheless, it hurts. I suppose I'm emotionally attached to my childhood country. The above paragraphs dealt with Maltese, that is, those with a sense of cultural relativity. The reactions from the monos were far more emotional. As monos, they did not have the experience of having lived in another culture/country to be able to relativize the inferiorities of their own culture as seen by a cold-eyed Maltese. They would feel that they had been attacked personally and would react very emotionally, sometimes getting verbally violent. Let me illustrate this with a concrete example. Shortly before finishing this book, I went to visit my aging father in Australia, the first of my 7 cultures. Australia is a migrant nation, rather like the US or Canada, that is, a British colony. Many of the migrants in earlier decades were from Britain. The Australian slang word for a Brit is a POM, P-O-M. This term is thought to have been derived from the acronym P-O-H-M, Prisoner of His Majesty, that is, the King of England. After a generation or 2 of settling in Australia, the settlers started to develop their own cultural folkways and values that had to adapt to the geographical and cultural realities of their migrant lives. The newly arrived POHMs were monocultured Brits, and hence were different from the Australians. That's Australian low-class accent for Australians. In the post-World War II years, migration rates rose as the Australian government learned its lesson that a small country in population terms is vulnerable to invasion, as the threat of a Japanese invasion in World War II illustrated. Many Brits, impoverished by the privations of the war with the Nazis, chose to migrate to Australia. So in the post-World War II years, a new expression became current in Australia, that is, whinging bloody pom. That is Australian slang for complaining damned Brit. This is a typical mono reaction. When the Poms arrived in Australia, they came to a culture quite different from the one they were accustomed to, far less sophisticated, no upper class, extremely provincial-minded. A European culture tucked away in Southeast Asia, with a British working-class mentality of brawn over brain, and a sport-dominated anti-intellectualism. No wonder the newly arrived Brits were shocked, because they could speak the language. They were, after all, the colonising power, the mother country. They had immediate access to Australian culture, and were often bitterly disappointed by what they saw and heard. Many returned to Britain. For the majority who stayed, it was inevitable that they would complain, and complain hard. The migrant Brits felt in many ways they were superior to the native Australians because they felt they came from a superior culture, and they felt they could teach the monocultured Australians, the Australian monos, about the superiorities of Britain. So they complained, they whinged. From the perspective of the Australian monos, all they saw were whinging pommy bastards, WPBs. Of course, as monos, they had no idea what the WPBs were talking about. The basis for comparison used by the migrant Brits to criticise Australia, that is, based on their experiences of life as they lived it in Britain, was totally outside the life experience of the Australian monos. We now have a classic interaction between multis and monos. The monos don't understand why the multis are complaining, and the multis get frustrated by the intercultural ignorance of the monos. If the multis push their views onto the monos, there's a good chance the monos will end up telling the multis to go to hell. However, since the rise of the jumbo jet, millions of monos have started to travel to other countries and to become multied to some extent. Now, millions of people are beginning to understand what the multis are talking about. The impact of the multi-mentality is becoming stronger. Let me now give another example of what a multicultured life can teach a mono. Take the case of the hypothetical young American mono who is curious, adventurous, and hungry to learn, who decides to take himself off to Europe for several years to increase his life experience. He stays a year or two in each of London, Paris, and Berlin, picking up the languages each time, getting fairly fluent, to the point that for the rest of his life he can absorb the media from those countries. Ask yourself what impact such a life experience would have upon the mentality of that now not so young American? He would have absorbed into his personality the cultural riches of 4 of the world's top cultures. That would make him a top worlder. Imagine how that experience would have changed his outlook on the world. Imagine how he would interact with a mono from any of those 4 cultures. He would inevitably compare the strength and weaknesses of the 4 cultures he had lived in. He would praise and condemn each culture in turn. He would have mixed feelings about each country he had lived in, because he would have such a strong basis for comparison. For each trait of each culture, he could compare how the other 3 rank with it. He would be ranking the whole time. Oh, custom X was better in culture Y than in culture Z because of ... In my own case, I can identify strongly with that hypothetical young American, because I have lived in 7 countries/cultures, which I list here so you know. 1. Sydney and Melbourne, Australia, 0 to 23, that's in age, and 35 to 36 years old. 2. London, Cambridge in England, 23 to 29 years old. 3. Eindhoven, Holland, 29 to 30 years old. 4. Brussels, Belgium, 30 to 44 and 53 to 54 years old. Kyoto, Japan, 44 to 52 years old. 6. Utah, USA, 54 to 59 years old. 7. Wuhan, Xiamen in China, 59 to now. In a week I will be 70, and in a year or 2 I will probably return to Australia, because my sister I'm ad-libbing now of course, my sister has very generously offered to buy an apartment, allow me to live in it rent-free. So that would be very nice. And since Australia now has the internet, I can live virtually anywhere. But I'll probably take myself off for a couple of years to live in Cambridge, England, where I was happiest, living amongst my own kind. Back to the book. Having lived in 7 countries gives me a strong basis for comparison. I have lived in the new and the old worlds, in the northern and southern hemispheres, in the east and the west. This unique experience has given me a wonderful basis for comparison, although to be honest, it is not all wine and roses. I still have to live in the world, and the reality of the present time is that most people in most countries are still monos. It's therefore not surprising that there are times when I get very frustrated when I have to deal with real monos in daily life. There are times when I feel like jumping up and down saying, look, there are better ways to live. Look at country X and your custom C. The X's do it better. Learn from them. I could stand on a soapbox at the corner of the street haranguing the monos passing by, but that would be a total waste of time. So instead I'm writing this book, because that way I can reach a much larger audience, much larger public, and ad-libbing now, and by making a YouTube video, or minds.com video, I reach a broader public again, broader. Also, a book lives on after the death of its author, unless it goes out of print and is totally forgotten about, which is often the case, unfortunately. Well, hence another advantage of making videos. Often the ideas of authors can seem crazy or ahead of their time, but as the years pass, there's a chance that the rest of society catches up, so that there is a revival of interest in the ideas expressed in their books. In this case, video book. In my own view, based on my own life experience, it's all too clear to me that the monos have a ton to learn from the multis. There are roughly 200 countries in the world, and most of them are almost totally mono. Due to our current state of telecommunications technology, it's very difficult for people to be exposed to the life experiences of other cultures. But that's about to change. We already have the internet, and it's having a revolutionary effect on the world, as great if not greater than the invention of the printing of books, which democratized the reading of ideas to the masses instead of only to the priesthood. In a mere human generation, we will have an internet with a bit rate, that is, the number of bits of information passed down a cable per second, that will be 1 billion times faster than current speeds. This increase in speed will revolutionize the planet culturally, socially, politically, intellectually, because it will enable the creation of a world media so vast that all sources of information, all media from the whole planet will be able to be delivered to everyone on the planet. Everyone gets everything. The images transmitted by this media will be in vivid 3D, 3 dimensions, and with the same level of resolution, almost as a real-life image. With such telecom technology will come the growth of a world language, which will very probably be English, since it is already the world's most understood second language. The creation of a world language will probably only happen once, since most people will not bother to learn a second world language that is foreign to them. It takes too much time and effort. With the development of a world language and a global media, it's then likely that the planet will culturally homogenize. This book argues that there are certain preconditions for the formation of a global state. They are A. The establishment of a global media, called Glomedia in this book, that delivers the entire planet's media to every person on the planet, so that everyone is exposed to the best ideas from the globe. B. The use of a global language, probably English, so that everyone can communicate with everyone on the planet. C. Global cultural homogenization, which I believe will be the consequence of the above two prerequisites. Once the planet thinks the same, has the same values, ideas and lifestyles, absorbing the best the planet has to offer, the world's cultures will understand each other better and be more inclined to unify politically, to form a global state. There are now so many technological, economic, social and political forces pushing towards the creation of a more global culture that I believe the time is now right for billions, not just millions, of people to become more multi in their outlook as a stepping stone towards the creation of a global state. This second major theme of this book, that is, the creation of a global state, is the more important one. In effect, the first major theme, that is, that the multis have a lot to teach the monos, is almost irrelevant compared to the importance of the second. Creating a global state will rid the world of war, of poverty, and will allow its global citizens to live in a truly global culture, benefiting from the best that its constituent cultures have to offer. Now, ad-libbing, I think there when I was writing this, unconsciously assuming it would be democratic. I've since become conscious of the existence of the New World Order, brutal dictatorship by the Jewish banksters, the Jewish elite, with a global capital in Jerusalem and a fascist dictatorship, which obviously I bitterly oppose. But I see it as a serious rival to this conception in this book of a democratic global state. So I'm more cynical now. Back to the book. 2/3 of this book, that is, the later chapters, deals with this topic. They talk about why I feel a global state is coming, very probably this century, and in fact probably even before mid-century. It discusses what the preconditions are for the creation of a global state, what the obstacles and resistances will be against its creation, how existing institutions might be modified to create a global state, and what new institutions a global state will probably need. It also discusses what a global state needs to do once it has been created to make the world a happier place and democratic. For example, by making war impossible, by ridding the world of nuclear weapons, by channeling funds to eliminate poverty from the world, by spreading the best features of the world's cultures to the whole planet, by continuing to foster the development of a world media and a world language, etc. In more detail, the chapters deal with the following topics. Chapter 1 is this introductory chapter that touches on the two major themes of this book, namely that the multis have a lot to teach the monos, and that the citizens of the world would be a lot better off in many respects if they were to create a global state. This chapter gives an overview of what this book is about. Chapter 2 is a long chapter presenting the pros and cons, that is, the superiorities and inferiorities of 8 different countries/cultures. These cultures are in most cases world-class cultures, that is, those that have the highest status in the world, that are the most prestigious, or have the most potential to be prestigious. I have lived in most of these cultures, so I can speak from first-hand experience. I hope that this fact will give this book and its major themes a greater level of credibility than if it were written by a mono trying to make similar points. Frankly, I don't see how a mono could have written these early chapters. A mono would not have the depth of intercultural life experience. Chapter 3 is the sequel to Chapter 2. It takes the cons of each country discussed in the previous chapter and suggests how these cons could be overcome by having the country/culture concerned adapt new customs by learning how other cultures do things better. This chapter shows what the multis can teach the monos, which is one of the major themes of the book and even features in the book's title. Ad-libbing now, I think this book's was a somewhat later version. I think I merged the two chapters, Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. It's only a minor difference. Chapter 4 is devoted to the costs that we pay by currently not living in a global state. For example, war, conscription, defence budgets, the arms trade, ignorance of better ways to live, inability to learn the superiorities of other cultures, etc. Chapter 5 presents a long list of well over a dozen factors, technological, economic, etc., that make the creation of a global state increasingly probable this century. Chapter 6 describes the many institutions that will be needed to actually run a global state. Chapter 7 talks about the many cultural, social, political, psychological factors that will oppose or resist the creation of a global state. For example, national sovereignty, ideological and religious differences, alienation, etc. Chapter 8 discusses the various routes to achieving global. For example, one could continue to expand the number of countries joining the EU, European Union, or bring together the various economic blocs, such as the EU, NAFTA, North